So, how do you pronounce smoked beer?
What do you want to try first?
No, I want to try and emulate you because I promise you I'll do a
Okay,
poor job of it anyway.
okay. If you pronounce it correctly in German, it's Rauchbier.
Rauch. That
Yeah, very,
close?
very
Rauch.
close, very close.
All right.
Have your throat needs to vibrate, then you're there.
I'm not
Rauchbier.
sure I can get it to do that. Rauch.
Yeah,
Hey,
that one was good. That was very
well,
good.
that was good. Maybe, maybe after three of these, I can do that.
Yeah, after three Schlenkerla, you pronounce anything. No problem.
Hello and welcome to the Gourmet Brewing Podcast. This season, we're learning from brewers about their delicious lagers and how they created them. I'm your host, Doug Piper. I'm a speaker, cicerone, and international food and beverage judge. Today's featured guest is Mattias Trom. He's the owner and head brewer at the ancient Schlenkerla Brewery in Bamberg, Germany. Schlenkerla is only one of two breweries in the entire world still brewing smoked beer the same way for over 5 centuries. During our discussion, Mattias shares his fascinating stories of medieval Germany right up until World War II. We discuss how his brewery is part of the Ark of Food and the challenges of brewing using ancient methods. Jason is a marvelous storyteller, and you'll enjoy hearing about the origins of smoked beer and why Bamberg is the only place you can find smoked beers brewed using the original ancient methods. Now let's join our discussion as Mattias is describing the challenges of 21st century methods, but in a medieval location.
That's the first thing we can share about the brewery, actually. The brewery is on two locations, or Schlenkerla is on two locations. When people travel to Bamberg, usually they're being told your visit to Bamberg is not complete without visiting Schlenkerla. And by that, whoever tells you that, they refer to the Brewery Tavern, which is in the Altstadt, the old quarter, close to the cathedral. Beautiful brewery tavern, Gothic ceiling, wooden barrel tapping, old furniture, hundreds of years old. And in the old ages, hundreds of years ago, the brewing was actually done down there as well, in the back of the building. So the Schlenkler consists of several buildings which grew together over time. I'm sitting now actually in the brewery, which is up on Oberer Stephansberg. It's about 10-minute foot walk from the brewery. It's still in the old quarter of town. That's why we had that solar panel monumental zone kind of problem thing. The reason why I'm saying it's up on the hill is that there's rock cellars underneath the brewery building here, and these cellars also are very ancient. They date back almost 1,000 years. And Bamberg brewers, all the breweries, used to have one rock cellar underneath this hill or one of the other of Bamberg hills. Now the reason for this was when you produce lager beers, you need low temperatures for fermentation and for lagering, hence the name, around 8 to 10 degrees Celsius. Now, in modern breweries these days, you have artificial cooling units that produce that coldness which you need. That technology was only invented in 1872, so a little more than 100 years ago. Before that time, the natural coolness of the rock cellars was the only means for brewers to keep the beer cool for a longer time, especially throughout the summertime. So beer was brewed in the breweries across town and then transported up to the lagering facilities in the cellars, in the rock cellars on the hills. And after the maturation, depending on style, this might have been weeks or even months, the beer was brought back down to the brewery pub, wherever that was in the city, and then being served there. And once artificial cooling was invented, the breweries closed down their rock cellars in order to forego this unnecessary back and forth transport. and they built directly cooled units adjacent to the breweries, run with ice machines running on ammonia. And Schlenkerla went exactly the other way. My ancestors, I'm the sixth generation, and my ancestors said, no, we want to keep the rock cellars in operation, and they moved the brewery from the back of the brew pub up on the hill on top of the rock cellars. So nowadays we have the smoke malt production, the brewing, and the rock cellars all in one location. So this brewery here basically works on 4 or 5 stories levels because the rock cellars also have several layers. So there's not just one, there's 3 layers of rock cellars basically. And we have all this in this historic setting up here. So the entire production is here on Oberer Stephansberg. And then the wooden barrels are transported down to the brewery pub in Dominikanerstraße in the Altstadt and being served there. So whenever you travel Bamberg, you have to think, where do you want to go? Do you want to see the brewery, which basically you can only see from the outside, like there's no serving up here. We only do occasional brewery tours. Or whether you go to the tavern to actually experience the smoked beer on site. But it's 2 locations.
Wow. I'm ready to go. I want to go see this.
Jump on the plane. The nearest airport is Nuremberg, or Frankfurt is also 2 hours away, so very easy to come to Bamberg. And it's apart from Schlenkerla, also a very, very beautiful town. UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1993. It's the largest intact old city quarter in all of Germany, because most of the other cities were at least partially destroyed in World War II. There was no bombing here in Bamberg because Bamberg didn't have much of an industry. And we have more than 2,000 protected buildings in town, Schlenkerla being one of them, half-timbered buildings, old stone buildings, the big cathedral, dozens of other churches, a very beautiful town hall, a historic one, which is built on an island in the river and accessed by bridges from both sides. So when you hit Bamberg in Google and look at the images there, there's a ton of really beautiful images of the town. So it's really like a time travel when you come to town here.
Well, I know I'm going to be in Belgium for the Brussels Beer Challenge. I'll do that the end of October.
Okay.
If I were to visit before then, a week before or something, is that a good time?
Yeah, basically any time is good because there's a lot of things you can do in Bamberg round the year. In the summertime, it might be even a little bit better because the beer gardens are open and the beer cellars, as we call them here, because they're also up on the hill. But October is fine. Then you have the bock beers from the various breweries, and a lot of museums are, of course, open. December is a very popular month to come because Bamberg has a long tradition of nativity scenes in churches. So the Jesuit monks of Bamberg, they were one of the first ones to build nativity scenes. I think they started that in the 17th century or something. So there's 45 churches in Bamberg that display nativity scenes in the month of December. And there's actually a round trip you can do. So you walk from church to church and you see these beautiful old handmade nativity scenes. And conveniently, while you're doing that round trip around town on foot, you pass by a number of breweries. So you can go between your bodily pleasures and the clarity of church visits. So it's a really nice combination. A lot of people do that in December, actually.
Well, that would be probably the oldest brewery I've been in. So it sounds like. So you said the rock cellars themselves go back 1,000 years.
The rock cellars in Bamberg as such, ours, the first mentioning of the premises here where the brewery is situated today, they date back to 1387. So roughly 100 years before Columbus sailed over to the Americas. And the owner back then already was a brewer. The document unfortunately does not say whether he was lagering the beer here and whether he was brewing here. But to be honest, why else would he have that premise? So it's very likely, but not provable, unfortunately. Schlenkerla itself, the building, the brew pub where the brewery used to be, dates back to the year 1405. At the time, it was called the House of the Blue Lion, so the name Schlenkerla came later. 1405, House of
What,
the
say
Blue
that
Lion.
again. It was called the what?
The House of the Blue Lion.
The Blue Lion. Okay. Is there
Um,
something
what,
significant about blue lions?
um, Not to Bamberg in particular. When you stand in front of the brew pub and you look at the antler, then you see the lion in there. I'm not 100% sure what the background story of that is, but in the old days when people had a hard time reading a lot of analphabets, taverns and public buildings would not have street names and numbers, but they would be named after something people could decipher and understand. So possibly at the time there was a picture of a blue lion hanging on the outside. So the house adjacent to the House of the Blue Lion, which today also belongs to the tavern, was called the House Under the Storks. So probably they had a big nest of storks on the chimney or something. So you had these bloomy kind of flavory kind of descriptions of houses rather than street names and numbers. That came later when literacy was more commonplace. So the original name was House of the Blue Lion. Later on, it was called the Brewery of the Blue Lion. Coopers were owners of the building because coopers and brewers in Bamberg were associated in the same guild. Brewers would always produce their own barrels, and barrel makers would produce their own beer. So it was an interconnected business, if you will. Maybe a little bit similar to what the whiskey distillers in the States today do in Tennessee. They produce their own barrels simply because it makes sense because they have the optimal quality control in there. The official company name today is actually not Schlenkerla, it's Hellerbräu or Brewery Helle. And the Hellers were the owners starting in the 17th century. They were also brewmasters, so the official name dates back to those days. And technically, I'm the 14th brewmaster of Heller. And the name Schlenkerla, which of course today is the most famous description of the business and of course of the beer, that dates back to my great-great-grandfather. He, according to legend, had an accident in the brewery. We don't know what happened, whether he fell over a wooden barrel or whether he drank too much beer or the brewery horses stepped on his toes or something like that happened. And he was limping afterwards because of that. And when you limp, you kind of usually you dangle your arms, you weaver in order to keep the balance when walking. And in Franconian vernacular, this is called schlenkern, a dangling walk. And the regular customers of our brewery, of the brew pub, they gave my ancestor the nickname Schlenkerla, which means the little dangler, basically a fun name, a nickname. He was supposedly he was a very strict patron and very strict with the customers so that they behaved well. Women were somewhat, well, not so well accepted in brewery pubs at the time. It was more men's thing to get together and drink. So everything was a little bit more strict than it is today. So this nickname probably was a certain form of getting back at the patron by the regulars. And so they said, when they came to the tavern, they said, let's go to Schlenkerla. And they meant the person by that, the patron. But over time, that became synonymous with the brewery, with the building, and eventually with the beer. And nowadays, in a way, it's programmed because smoke beer, Rauchbier, is an acquired taste. So it's not that easy when you have it your first glass. And there's an old Bamberg proverb that says you have to drink 3 pints to fully acquire the flavor and really get into the appreciation of the Schlenkerla Rauchbier. So after
That probably originated with the breweries.
maybe a cool marketing concept from 100 years ago, so I don't know. So even if after the 3rd pint you don't like the beer, I still had my margin there. So yeah, that's okay. But nevertheless, there's a flavor background to it as well from a scientific point of view. the perception of flavor is split up in our body. So our mouth actually only perceives 5 different types of flavor: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. All the other flavors we perceive with our nose. So it's an olfactory element to that. That's why when you have a cold, foods don't taste as well, because you cannot perceive them in your closed up nose, basically. And this is very important for smoke perception, for smoke flavor perception. So when you drink a sip of smoke beer, the smoke in your mouth or the smoke in the beer becomes airborne, gets into your nose, and then you perceive that smoke flavor. It's the same that happens when you are on a campfire and you smell the smoke from the fire there. And now happens something. You might have noticed that for yourself. When you come to a room and you recognize there's a new smell in there, it's very intense at the beginning, but very quickly that smell sensation passes and you adapt to that smell in the room. And that's exactly what's happening when you drink a smoke beer. At the beginning, the smoke is really, when you have it for the first time in your life, the smoke is really overpowering, and you basically only perceive the smoke itself, and you don't perceive as well the other flavor elements of the beer, although there's plenty of. And after the first pint, your nose kind of settled into that smokiness, and the smokiness moves a little back in the flavor perception, and then the other flavors are coming out: the maltiness, the bitterness, the rich flavor of the beer itself. So in effect, when you have your first 2 or 3 pints of smoke beer in your life, you will perceive those actually as 3 different beers. And only with the third one, you're there in the flavor. So there's some background to that saying, and it's not just, hey, I want to sell you 3 beer. Yeah, there's really a story behind it. There's no guarantee that after the third pint you're going to like it. There's a lot of people that have difficulty with smoky flavors in general, and smoked beer in particular. I would say 50% of the people hate it and 50% of the people love it, and there's little in between. But
why do you think that is? Because, I mean, bacon. Who doesn't like bacon? And it's
all
smoked.
The vegetarians. all the vegetarians.
True, but I mean, let's take the ones that are okay with meat. Well, I guess I was about to say cheese, but I guess that eliminates the vegetarians too. But I mean, that was actually one of the things I wanted to dive into. Why is it so unusual for people to go, "Oh, I don't like smoked beer," when they probably never even tried it, but they love bacon, they loved, smoked cheeses. There's so many things that smoke adds to. Why is that?
Well, if they say that without having tried it, it's prejudice. Yeah, so I wouldn't give too much on that one. There's a lot of people out there that don't have an open mind, that don't like to try something. I mean, food in particular is always difficult. Everybody who has little children knows that. It's green, I don't eat it. So I think this is really hardwired into our brain, that we're careful about trying food, because in the old days, potentially you would die from eating something which is poisonous or so. So we're careful about new food. With the smoke flavor in the beer, I guess everybody is accustomed to smoke flavors in meats because it's so commonplace. There's a lot of meats out there that have smoky aroma to it. And depending on preparation, when you do barbecue or some form of open preparation, you always have a certain smoke component to it. In liquids, however, it's much less common. There's Chinese smoky teas. There's whiskey, of course, which obviously you only start drinking at a certain age. But there's no smoky beverages which you drink as a child, except when you live in China and you have that tea. But in our cultural background, I don't really know any beverages a child would drink with a smoky flavor. So you have to make a bigger step in order to adjust yourself to that, and you basically have to jump into the cold water and try it out. And a lot of people are afraid of these trials in a way. Yeah. When you come to China and you're being presented with foul eggs, your first impression would be, do I really want to eat that? Because, yeah. And it's just so uncommon for people. And then the second thing is, in particular for the traditional or for the classic smoke beer, as Schlenkerla does it, that the level of smokiness is relatively high, even compared to something like bacon. So it's 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 a big step you're doing. It's a big step for a beer drinker and a small step for mankind to yeah to put it that together. But it's really worth it. When you make that leap and you jump into it and you are part of the lucky 50% who really appreciate the flavor, you're in for a real treat.
So you say beverages, and I like your point. Beverages really are not common to have smoke in them, whereas meats, cheeses, certain foods certainly are. But that's not always been true, right? I mean, if you go back 200-300 years, was smoked beers more common?
Definitely. Um, we have to make the big cycle now. I hope you bear with me. Beer has been around for 15,000 years. Just recently, they discovered in Haifa in Israel a brewery from 13,000 BC. So adding that to the 2,000 years since then, that makes it 15,000 years. And the Babylonians were brewing beer, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, and it's a very common drink and beverage at the time. Writing was invented because of the need to document amount of barley and beer being produced in Sumerian times. So it's been a beverage that's been with humanity for a very long time, basically since the beginning of civilization, together with bread. Bread and beer was integral part of early civilization. And the basic principle of beer brewing hasn't changed very much over time. You always started off with a grain, barley, spelt, wheat, whatever. Then you first have to malt that in order to generate certain enzymes, which later on you need in the brewing process. Then you mash the liquid, then you boil it, you add hops or other spices and herbs, and then you ferment it. So that's the basic principle. Now, the interesting part as when we look at smoked beer is the malting part. So in the malting part, the grain at some point needs to be dried. Now, for drying, traditionally there was two different ways of doing that. Either you dry it by the air in the sun, which was probably the common thing they would do in old Mesopotamia and in Egyptian times because it was a dry climate there and a lot of sun in the summertime, so it was easy to dry that way. The old cultures of Central Europe, however, the German tribes, the Celtics and so forth, when they were brewing beer, they lived in a much more moist and colder climate. So for them, the only means of drying malt was open fire. And so it was unavoidable that the smoke from that fire would also touch the grain and give it a smoky aroma and flavor. So in Central Europe, back in the old days, all the beers had a smoky flavor. And for thousands of years, that was the common thing. There's an old excavation site here in Germany, 2,500 years old, of a kiln that clearly shows it was a smoke kiln. They even have a smoky grain from the time. Now, this was the common technology all the way until the 17th century. In Great Britain, in England, where the industrialization started, a whole new era of technology broke out. And England had depleted much of their wood supply, and they were dependent on wood imports. The Dutch would cut down forests in the Baltics and bring that wood over to England and sell it. And as today, back then, imports were something which the officials, the politicians, the king didn't fathom very much because it meant money leaves the country. So there was an interest in reducing the wood that needs to be imported. Now the problem is when you do a smoked malt, you need high-grade hardwood in order to produce a pleasant flavor in the beer. You cannot use pine trees, you cannot use waste wood, you cannot use coal or any other fuel because the smoke would basically deteriorate the flavor of the malt and hence of the beer. So there was a need to find a way of filtering out the smoke in the malt production. And there was an English inventor, Sir Nicholas Halls from Cornwall, southern England, and he developed a kiln which channeled the smoke outside before actually heating the barley and drying the barley. And he got a patent on 23rd of July 1635 for his invention by King Charles I. So this is the first documentation of a non-smoke kiln. And from then on, because that technology was less of a fire hazard, it had the economic benefit of not of becoming independent of high quality wood. So brewers very quickly switched to coal as fuel, which was much cheaper than the high grade wood. And the British Crown enforced the technology because they wanted to become less dependent on imports, and also because it was less of a fire hazard. And then the industrialization went its way. More patents were developed, the technology was refined, the kilns were enlarged in size. The breweries stopped producing their own malt, and malt factories were founded, which produced malt on a much larger scale and hence even cheaper than before. And within 100 years, the smoke kilns had more or less vanished in England, except for some whiskey distillers, but all the breweries had stopped making smoke beers. And around 1800, that technology, together with the rest of industrialization, swept over to continental Europe. The steam engine, the weaving stool, but also the English kiln, as they called it, which was a smoke-free kiln. Here in Bavaria, the Spaten Brewery of Munich, which some people might know, large brewery these days, they were one of the first breweries in Germany to close down their Bavarian kiln, meaning smoke kiln, and to replace it with an English kiln, meaning non-smoke kiln. So, to make a long story short, smoke beers were the standard type of beer for thousands of years until the British invented something else which was cheaper in production and became the common beer which we know today, which is a non-smoky beer. And the achievement of Schlenkerla was not that we invented it or rediscovered it or specialized in some way. Our achievement was of simply not making that transition to the modern technology. We kept on doing what we've been doing since the 15th century and never switched to the modern technology where almost everybody else did it. There's one other brewery in the world that did the same. That's the Spezialbrewery here of Bamberg as well. So us too, we stuck to the old technology and everybody else changed to the new technology. And that's the reason why in 2017, Spezial and Schlenkerla became members of or passengers of the Ark of Taste from Slow Food, because obviously with the craft beer revolution nowadays, there's a lot of smoky beers out there being produced with industrial made smoke flavored malts, but there's only two breweries, Schlenkerla and Spezial, that do it or have been doing it continuously since the old ages. And therefore, the organization, the non-profit organization Slow Food, said that this historic production method is close to extinction with only two producers left in the world. And economically, it's not as efficient and not as cost advantageful like the industrial smoke flavored versions. So there's a certain risk or a certain economic pressure to not continue the old tradition. And that's why we've been, I see it as an award actually, we've been awarded with that status of an ARC passenger. And I can assure you that as long as I'm on the helm here of Schlenkerla, that the smoke kiln will stay in operation. We definitely will continue this old tradition because the flavor is so much different than in the industrial smoke flavored malts and in the industrial made smoky beers. So this old tradition is really safe with us. But of course, with only two producers, there's a certain minimal risk. Yeah, you never know what happens. So I'm really happy that we got that status.
So that draws me to one of the other questions that I had. It seems like Bamberg is always associated with smoked beers. I
Right.
think you kind of
Right.
touched on the answer why, but is there any other reason, why Bamberg?
Well, because here's the only spot in the world where two breweries continuously did the old way and continue to produce the smoked beer. And the with the craft beer revolution, which basically already started in the 1980s with Michael Jackson Beer Hunter in the UK and the first craft breweries open up in the US, um, people looked out to historic beer styles. And there's, I think you can actually get it on YouTube from Michael Jackson from the 1980s, his piece on Bamberg, where he shows the story on smoke beer and where it came from and how it is being produced. I mean, exactly the same kiln as we have today. And that created a lot of awareness in the professional brewing world for this style having survived here in Bamberg. And obviously, these newly founded craft breweries at the time were looking for beers to produce, so they started doing smoked beers as well. In fact, my father told me that in the beginning we received quite a lot of requests for purchasing our smoke malt, especially from the United States. Um, the problem, or the company philosophy, however, is that we only produce for our own needs and we don't sell our malt at all, and we don't have the capacity to do so anyhow. And uh, where there's a demand, there's going to be a supply. So the industrial producers jumped on the occasion and found a way of smoke flavoring their industrial malts and started supplying the craft breweries, and it went from there. Um, I I think it's actually quite interesting because um, the style is more present in the market as if there were only two producers. What's important for me always is to convey to consumers that there's the modern smoke beers, which is 99% of what's out there, and then there's the traditional ones, which is Schlenkerla and Spezial. So when you want to truly um, experience the style and the flavor, you would have to look out for one of the original producers. Preferably, actually, one like our classic Marzen or the Urbock, where you have 100% smoke malt built in there. The This one exactly. The Spezial Brewery usually does blends between smoke malt and regular malt because their operation is a little bit smaller. So, long story. Basically, Schlenkerla is a living fossil of breweries, a dinosaur, a sip of beer history. And because that survived in Bamberg, uh, it became synonymously called the Bamberg Rauchbier, the Bamberger Rauchbier or Bamberg smoke beer.
Okay. Well, that makes sense. But I mean, it sounds like Bamberg, which I have not visited and need to. Uh, I mean, it sounds like you're a very historic area anyway, that there's a focus on history. So your forefathers must have been just, hey, just because it's new doesn't make it great.
Well, that's the one reason that there was a certain awareness, but also there were some situative background reasons. First of all, the abolishment of smoke kilns went hand in hand with switching to coal as a primary fuel for kilns. Here in Bamberg, in all of Bavaria for that matter, there's no coal mines. So having coal as a fuel here was harder than elsewhere. It had to be transported by trains from the industrial areas of Germany, which at the time were Schlesien in eastern, nowadays Poland, at the time that was Germany, and the Rhein-Ruhr-Gebiet, Cologne, Düsseldorf, Dortmund, the Ruhrpott as they call it. So that there was a certain effort behind that. So it's actually easier to stick with the old technology. The other thing is, I mentioned earlier that you need high quality wood to make a good smoke malt. And the most typical tree or the most typical type of wood to be used for that was beech wood. That's what we still use today. And conveniently, to the west of Bamberg is one of the largest beechwood forests of Germany. So the beechwood supply was easier to get than the coal supply. That was one of the reasons, I think. The second reason is that in almost every other part of Germany, and the rest of Europe for that matter, with the industrialization of beer brewing and other businesses, smaller producers were squeezed out of the market and replaced or swallowed by big industrial producers. So when you look at breweries today, the amount of beer they're producing, this is vastly more than in the old days. Really, extremely vastly more. In the old days, breweries would do, I don't know, 700 barrels a year. That was a typical size for a brewery. And nowadays they do hundreds of thousands, if not millions of barrels. That development was considerably less pronounced here in northern Bavaria and Franconia, and in particular in Bamberg. Most of the breweries here are still very small, not quite as small as back then, but still in the 5 to 10,000 barrel range. Schlenkerla has 20,000 barrels a year. I'm counting a barrel being 1 hectoliter, which I think is roughly in the direction. So this concentration process that happened elsewhere did not happen in Franconia to that extent. And for a small brewery, it was easier to have one of the brewers do the malt on the side while doing the rest of the brewery operations and the brewery works. In bigger breweries, there was more of a cost pressure. It was more about efficiency and doing things as effectively as possible. So for them, it made more sense to either shut down the malting operation altogether and buy the malt from big producers, or to modernize their own production process. And here in Bamberg, it's actually documented. The first non-smoke kiln was built in 1842, so roughly 200 years after the invention in England. So at the time, back then, technology transfer took much longer than today. And by 1900, so only 50 years later, all the Bamberg breweries, which was 70 breweries at the time, except Schlenkerla Spezial and 2 more, had closed down their smoke kilns. So 95% of the breweries switched from the old to the new technology, even here, within 50 years of the first introduction. And the four that survived, that was Spezial and Schlenkerla, which still do today. Greifenklau, that brewery also still exists today, but they closed down their malting operations after World War II, so they have normal malt these days and no smoke beer. And the third one was the brewery Pollerbeer, and this one was closed in World War II altogether because the owner died in the war. So yeah, now there's only Schlenkerla and Spezial left. So there was certain situative elements that played into the survival here. But as you pointed out, I think the deliberate decision of my ancestors played a key role in doing that. There's commercial ads from the 1920s when already the uniqueness of smoke beer and of Bamberg smoke beer was emphasized, and people already started traveling to Bamberg at the time to have that flavor. So that was a really quick development when you think that within 50 years before, still a majority of the breweries would do it, and then suddenly all of them were gone. So I think my great-grandfather, Michael Graser, he was the one who made that deliberate decision, and he also is responsible for the beautiful inside view of the brewery tavern, the old depictions in there, the careful restoration of the Gothic chapel inside the tavern. So I think he was really ahead of his time
The
and had
Gothic chapel?
there's a chapel in our tavern actually, or a former chapel. It's now well, not normal, but it's the guest room, so you can sit in there, drink your beer. But you have this Gothic tilted ceiling on
Yeah.
over it, and you're sitting like in an old church. And this used to be the chapel of the Dominican monastery of Bamberg. And
Ah,
the monastery was closed down 200 years ago in the secularization. And then the state of Bavaria, first the kingdom Bavaria, later on the state of Bavaria used the building for various purposes. And in the 1920s, my great-grandfather was able to rent it from the state of Bavaria. And after World War II, my grandfather was in a lucky position to know the right people in Munich, where the government was, and he was able to purchase it. So it's a fixed part of the brewery tavern. When you go to the Schlenkerla website on the starting page, there are 4 images interchanging, and there's one view of that chapel in there, and it's really amazing. There's few taverns in the world that have something like that, and I'm really grateful to my great grandfather that he took the chance and restored it to the way it is today.
well, I'm glad you mentioned slow foods because I think one thing I've really begun to appreciate is how you can use beer to cook with.
Right.
So, have you ever found a good recipe that you can actually add the smoked beer to, and it's a complementary flavor?
It works quite well. There's even historic recipes like that. In our tavern, we serve a dish that's called the Bamberg style onion. So Bamberg was not only known as a beer town, but also as a gardener's town. There's a lot of commercial gardens in town where vegetables are grown. And the nickname of the Bamberg gardeners was the onion stumpers. So what they did in the old days, they don't do that anymore today. But in the old days, they would stump on the plant from the onion when it was growing in order to make sure that the onion in the soil stays larger and that not too much energy goes into the actual plant. So the Bamberg onion is larger than a regular onion. Um, it's milder in flavor, and the recipe is basically you carve out the inside of the onion. You fill that with a mixture of pork belly and pork minced meat, roast it in the oven for several hours, then a piece of bacon and a smoked beer sauce to accompany it. So you have that smoky flavor in the sauce.
A smoked beer salt?
So
Is that what you
sauce, smoked beer sauce,
sauce?
a gravy, smoked beer
A
gravy.
gravy.
Yeah. And mashed potatoes to go with that, and that's just the perfect combination. It ideally balances the classic Marzen smoked beer.
So a good way to incorporate it is to make a sauce with the smoked
Yeah,
beer.
that works quite well. You can do that for a lot of Franconian or Bavarian dishes like pork knuckles
Yeah.
with dumplings. So wherever you have a thick gravy, you can actually do that with a smoked beer. And it's easy enough. You prepare the gravy and you put to your personal taste smoked beer in to bring it to the smokiness you like it, and then you can serve it with any kind of meat. Um, Barbecued meat, of course, is great. That has that smoky flavor in there. So
I
that's
was about to say I think it'd be perfect in like an American barbecue sauce.
right. Definitely. Yeah.
No,
The
now I
other
know what.
thing, the other thing we do, we actually also cook with a smoked malt. And that's something you probably won't find elsewhere because, as I said, we do the smoked malt ourselves. We have our own Schlenkerla sausages. Of course, Bavaria Franconia is very famous for sausages. And the Schlenkerla sausages are a little bit special in that line. They're a little bit sweet in flavor, so a little bit comparable to the Nuremberg sausages, if you've ever seen them around. They're really small, tiny sausage, which have a sweet flavor to it because they contain, I think the English word is majoran, margarine, as a spice. And in the Schlenkerla sausages, we also have some smoked malt inside. So that sweet flavor is complemented by the sweetness from the malt and also by the smokiness from it. So it's a really a nice combination between the beer aroma and the sausage aroma. And these come with a sweet cabbage, not a sour cabbage, which is actually common for the typical Bavarian sausages. But this one comes with a sweet cabbage because that better complements the sweet aroma from the malt and from the marjoram. And smoked beer bread to go with that. So we have a bakery next door to Schlenkerla, conveniently, and they make a smoked beer bread using our smoked beer and smoked malt. So that all combines very well together.
Well, I am ready to try one.
Okay.
We have talked, and what I wish you would do, I'm not going to say anything. What I'd like to do is concentrate on a nice pour. I've never had this beer before, so I assume I should pour a good head and
yep,
and like a normal lager, correct?
Like a normal German lager. Not, please don't pour like a British ale or so where there's no foam on it. The eye wants to have something to drink as well, so a nice flower, please.
All right, so I'm going to switch cameras and I'm going to do the pour. And what I wish you would do is talk about the appearance and the aromas and the tastes, and then I will give it a try after you've kind of unpacked it for the audience.
Okay, so the classic Schlenkerla Marzen smoked beer is relatively dark in color, has about 55, 60 color units. When you hold it against the light, you will see that it's actually quite reddish in color. So it's similar to an old Nuremberg beer style called the red beer. When you open it and you dare to smell at the bottle opening, you will already notice quite considerable the smoky smell in it, accompanied by the carbonation, of course. When you pour, you will see that the foam is a little bit darker than you would expect it from normal lager beers. That's due to the fact that the beer itself is, of course, darker. And interestingly enough, most dark beers you have these days are made with roast malt, whereas the color in the smoked beer comes from the smoking process. And in the pour, you see it beautifully in the color, the reddish color from the Marzen, and the foam a little bit darker. And now you should notice the smokiness in the air already, to a certain degree. You're doing this quite well. When you're looking for when you're looking for a job, we need tappers here at the tavern, so you can come over anytime.
I like that plan.
So,
I will do that. So I was going to switch over.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to kind of talk about the beer. That of course is the label, but we have some beautiful color.
Right, reddish,
and that's
brown.
Quite dark for a Marzen.
That comes from smoking the malt. You also see that in the foam. That has also a little bit of that brownish kind of element to it. And as I said earlier, today most dark beers are made with roasted malt. So this is malt, ready-made malt, which is in addition roasted in big roast mills at, I think, 300 degrees Celsius. This is done. And this roasting process has only been around for 150 years or so. So before that time, the color of the beer came entirely from the actual kilning process. Now, the higher the temperature in the kilning process, the darker the beer. So a modern Pilsner lager type beer would be kilned at anywhere 60, 70, maybe 80 degrees Celsius. That way it stays relatively pale. The classic Marzen from Schlenkerla, or the classic smoke malt from Schlenkerla, the final temperature in the kiln is way above 100 degrees Celsius. Not way above, but it's above 100 degrees Celsius, around 110 or so. And that makes for the dark color. And
so it immediately reminds me of a kind of a malty bacon.
Right. Liquid bacon. Liquid ham, some people call it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But
In
it
German,
is not an oppressive smoke. And there's a lot of acrid smokes that are
okay,
out there, and this is far more of a barbecue kind of smoke, something very pleasant. And I can even smell the malt through
right.
the smoke, which surprises me.
In German, that actually rhymes even. Some people call it Schinken zum Trinken, which means a ham to drink.
A ham to well,
Schinken zum Trinken.
cheers.
Cheers.
Oh, that is quite pleasant. I've had through my judging experiences, I've judged all over the world, and I've had my share of smoked beers. I have not had this particular one
Okay.
that I know of. Most of the time when they're served, we don't know whose
Yeah,
it was.
that's the point. Yeah, that you don't argue. And the thing is, as I said earlier, um, once this recording is over and you have the time, I would recommend that you actually drink the rest with large sips, not as in a professional tasting, but really as the old people would have drank in the old days for a thirst quencher, and then you really get that full aroma and flavor. And there's a lot of wisdom to this old proverb that you need to drink 3 pints because it changes the perception of the flavor, what you have. Um, we sometimes get tourists at our tavern that are a little bit afraid of trying it because people said, "Oh, it's a weird flavor and you're not gonna like it." And so they're like, "Oh, I only want a very little sip." So they're really almost like scared of trying it. But that's not the way to perceive it. You really should take a deep sip and fully inhale the aroma and flavor, and then it really will take you there.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a phenomenal flavor. Again, akin to barbecue or bacon. I'm just astounded by the color. I mean, that to me, for Marzen, that's just. I was going to switch cameras. It's hard to believe how much it darkens the
The the
beer.
the typical Marzen beers, they are like amber color usually,
Yeah.
Bernstein in German, and this is way darker because we kiln at a higher temperature, and of course we have the smokiness in there. I mean, that's the same what happens on a barbecue when you have beef or a piece of meat in your smoker, it gets darker.
Well, I guess so. I did not expect that. That's the biggest change, and I love dark beers. So it's kind of like a. It doesn't taste like a dark beer because you really don't hit any of the roasty characteristics. I mean, there's no roasty
Right.
characteristic, which also surprised me by your malting process. I would have guessed there'd be a little touch of chocolate, but
No.
there's
The
it's just a little bit of caramel, maybe.
the roast
Definitely.
the roasting happens at much higher temperatures. So all these dark beers out there, porters, stouts, imperials, you have that roasty aroma, which is bitterness on the one hand, and on the other hand, these burnt kind of like flavors, which you also know from coffee. Um, you mentioned chocolate. It's the same thing. Chocolate beans are also roasted. But these are higher temperatures, and it's different chemical transformations that happen inside the grain. We don't go that high in the temperature. For us, it's just the actual kilning operation, and so you have that bacony kind of flavor, but you don't have a roasty kind of flavor. And you mentioned earlier that you used or that you took part in judging and at competitions. Most of the modern made smoke beers out there, they actually fail the category to a certain extent because they usually have that roast flavor. Um, Schlenkerla is often considered the classic example of the style. So professional brewers, when they do their smoke beer, they want to achieve the color we have. And since our smoke malt is not available commercially, they have to use the industrial smoke malts, which don't have the color of Schlenkerla. So they have to resort to roast malts in order to get the same optical appearance. But by that, they change the flavor.
Yeah.
And that's what I tried to convey early on. I wanted to say that when you do the traditional production method, you will get a different flavor than when you do it the modern way.
Well, I want to switch back to a couple of quick, easy questions. So, how do you pronounce smoked beer?
What do you want to try first?
No, I want to try and emulate you because I promise you I'll do a
Okay.
poor job anyway.
Okay. So if you pronounce it correctly in German, it's Rauchbier.
Rauch.
Yeah,
Close?
very
Rauch.
close. Very close.
All right.
Your throat needs to vibrate, then you're there.
I'm not
Rauchbier.
sure I can get it to do that. Rauch.
Yeah,
Hey,
that one was good. That was very good.
that was good. Maybe after 3 of these, I can do that.
Yeah, after 3 Schlenkerla, you pronounce anything. No problem.
Oh, all right. So the brewery name. So help me with the pronunciation of that. I want to try that too.
That's the brewery name is Schlenkerla.
Schlenkerla. Schlenkerla.
Schlenkerla. Schinkerla would mean the little ham. So that's close as well, but it's Schlenkerla.
Schlenkerla. Am I
No.
close?
No. Schlenkerla. Schlenkerla.
Schlenkerla.
No. Schlenkerla with E.
Okay. Well, help me with the first part. So there's the AECT. What is that and what does that mean?
It's the old German way of writing original or genuine, and it's pronounced echt. Echt.
It's echt.
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 So we have a CH in each of those words, which is really difficult for English native speakers. It's like Germans always struggle with the TH. English speakers struggle with the German CH. And so it's echt Schlenkerla Rauchbier.
All right. Echt Schlenkerla Rauchbier.
Yeah, that was very good. That's very good. We
I don't
try
know about
after
the
the
very
second
good
pint.
part.
No,
Well,
no, that's good. It's much
it's got
better
a
than
little-
the THs I had at the beginning.
Well, a little bit of deep south in the United States. This has been fantastic, Matthias. Well, and how do I pronounce your name correctly?
Mattias. That's very close.
Matthias.
Mattias.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
I
Matthew,
do
the German
try,
version of
even though I usually horribly fail. It's usually entertaining when I try. The one thing I wanted to kind of summarize, if somebody in the audience is interested in a smoked beer, just can't bring themselves to try it because it just doesn't make sense. Why would there be smoke in liquids? I understand smoke in bacon. I understand smoke in cheese. Smoke in a beverage, as you pointed out earlier, is really strange. So how would you summarize in 1 or 2 or even 3 sentences the joy and the experience of drinking a Rauchbier?
It's gonna give you a flavor experience which you never had in your life before. And even if you might not like in the end, it's something you will never forget for the rest of your life.
So give it a try.
Give it a try. Definitely. You're missing out on something if you don't try.
And if you're going to try a smoked beer, what beer should you try?
You should go with a classic smoke beer from one of the 2 classic producers. Preferably one with 100% smoke malt bill, which in effect would be either the classic Marzen Rauchbier, Schlenkerla Marzen, or the Schlenkerla Urbock. If you're already more professional in smoked flavors, you might want to try the Oak Smoke Double Bock from Schlenkerla. This is made with smoke malt produced not with beechwood but with oak wood. Sounds trivial at first, but it really results in a totally different aroma and flavor. And the color is much lighter. It actually goes more into the direction of an amber color. and it's a much smoother smoke than in the Marzen. The Marzen is very dominant and
Mhm.
almost overwhelming at first when you drink it. And the oak smoke doppelbock is a very smooth in flavor experience. So it's something for smoke lovers and a really unique treat. And
Is
with
that
8%,
available in the
it's
U.S.? Is
available.
it distributed?
Yeah, yeah. Our U.S. importer has the oak smoke doppelbock in the assortment as well. And I think they sell in most US states. So when you go to our website or you go to the website of our importer, Be United International in Connecticut, they can direct you to shops in your area where you should be able to get it.
I will have to contact them. We can do that offline, but I think that would be fun to fully explore,
Yeah,
really truly the right way to do smoked beers.
yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
Matthias, this was fantastic. So much fun. And wow, you have a wealth of knowledge, not only of the
Thank you.
history of the beer and the brewing of the beers, but your wonderful town of Bamberg.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So,
I enjoyed it very much as well. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present the traditional smoke beer. And it was very, very fun afternoon or morning in
and
your
as
case.
yeah, as we close, I had one question. As I try to pride myself on pouring beers in proper glassware, the
Right.
Europeans have taught me I should not pour it in anything but really the branded glass because it's optimized for that beer. So clearly I did not have that. So what would be the proper glassware that I would pour my Doppelbock in?
The Doppelbock actually would go well in the glass which you just used. Something which is a little bit more wider at the bottom and then closes at the top. So similar to a cognac glass so that the flavors and the smell come out perfectly. Apart from that, I don't see it quite as strict as you've been told. Obviously, breweries want to sell their branded glasses. Um, I don't think it's that extremely important. What is important is how thick the glass is and whether you drink from a glass or from a mug, because that actually is going to change the way you perceive the flavor. So for the Schlenkerla beers, I would always opt for the glass in order for you to perceive the color. I mean, that was a very impressive experience for you. And also, to my experience, flavors are better perceivable when you have a thin glass rather than a thick mug. The mug is good for color beers, summer beers, the thirst quenchers, which are not so overpowering or and complex in flavors. But anything which has a complex flavor, I would go with a thin glass. Relatively large opening at the top that when you drink, you can dive your nose into the glass because, as I said earlier, a lot of the aromas we perceive through the nose. Never drink it from the bottle because then you will lose out on all those flavors and it will you miss like 50% of the taste. So always pour it into a thin glass. That's my recommendation. And then it doesn't really matter what brand it says on the glass.
Well, I look forward to trying that. I will contact your importer so we can explore
Thank
these
you.
further. Again, thank
Great.
you so much for your time. That's going to really help our program tonight, where we have a live audience. We don't have that at the moment, and maybe in the future we can maybe do a broadcast from Bamberg. Do you ever
Sure.
do any collaborations with your other brewery?
No. In that one, we're very well strict, conservative. We are also a little bit laid back on brewery tours because we don't want people sneaking around in all the details. Like we show some basics,
Right.
but no collaboration brews because that would show too much of the smoke kilning operation, which we have been preserving for such a long time, and we see a little bit as a family secret as well.
Well, my question is, I guess, would the two of you join a discussion like this? Do you think that would be possible?
You mean with the Spezialbrewery
Yes.
or? Um, they're not as open. Well, I don't know. We would have to ask them, but usually they don't uh, uh, communicate as much with with the press and stuff like that. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't even know whether they speak English for that matter.
That would be a
So
problem. Your English is beautiful.
I
It is
lived in
phenomenal.
Canada for 1 year in a school exchange program, so I got lucky there. And
Wow. Well, your English is beautiful, and my German attempts are horrible, but that's okay. It's
well,
entertaining.
English is easier than German, so don't think anything of it. No, I got lucky.
Well, it sounds like you picked it up quickly because I'm not sure a year in Germany would do me a bit of good.
Well, I had it in school before because it's mandatory in German schools. So
Okay.
my children, they're now at primary school. They even start English in grade 3 now. So it's a very like Germany as being a big export country, and we know that we need to speak languages of other countries, and so English is very commonplace. I mean, all over technology, internet, software, music, it's everywhere, and it really helps a lot to get around. And speaking of which, it's much easier than German. That's why German never became a lingua franca, even though there was a lot of German immigrants to the United States. I think at some point there were even more Germans there than English natives. But obviously, our language is too complicated. So yeah,
Well, I look forward to visiting Bamberg. I hope I can get there when I'm, in Europe in October, if not before.
you're welcome anytime. Let me know.
And how would I get there? You said go into Frankfurt, and can I take a train direct
From
from Frankfurt?
not direct, you have to switch in Würzburg. When you said you're flying to Brussels, right?
I am,
From
yeah.
from Brussels, I think you can actually take speed trains all the way to Würzburg, and from there you take the regional train. So it should be something like 6, 7 hours by train. So you probably don't need an air interconnection. That is just gonna be longer.
Well, we love the trains in Europe. They're a real pleasure to take. So that I would look forward to. Well, I
Yep,
have kept you longer than an hour.
that's
Matthias,
okay.
thank you so much for your generous time, and I will send you a link for our event tonight, and whatever I do with this interview, I'll send you a link to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and have a great show tonight.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye
Appreciate
bye.
it.
Bye bye.
And remember, keep your computer running. Does it say what percentage it is now?
99% at the moment.
Oh, okay. So, what I was doing there was a bit of an experiment, and that's why it was not announced. But I'm running into challenges now, getting people now that we're out of, we're trying to get on the other side of COVID. A lot of people are just not available for evening events. So, technologically, I needed to try this. I want your feedback. Please let me know in the chat whether this seemed to work. It's hard to believe it's technologically a bit of a challenge, but it actually is. So I hope I pulled it off. So please let me know. I've got some great recordings coming up. I've been working with the brewer emeritus at Pilsner Urquell. Had a short interview with him already, and he was fantastic. Tobias Zolo and Scott Jennings can't do a live stream, and we're going to be specifically talking about their decoction versus their infusion mash. And anybody that's caught that knows we've had quite a lot of discussion there. We're going to actually do a tasting with their Helles versus their original, and Tobias Zolo and Scott Jennings are going to kind of wrestle that through. So I think that will be fun. And Philippe Janssens answered all the remaining 16 yeast questions. I had to do that as a recording too. So anyway, I'm trying to master this and figure out the best way to get it to everybody. So I'm very interested in your feedback. You have my email address, and we can talk in the chat, in the Zoom momentarily. So with that, I'm going to switch over to the Zoom. Hopefully it will pop up quickly, and we'll see you in just a minute on the Zoom. I'll post that one more time. But just so you know, it'll always be this same link. which is Gourmet Dash Hangout. So I put there in the chat and hope to see you in the Zoom call. Let me know how you think this worked and how best to promote it to everybody. See you in a second. Bye-bye.